The letter of introduction that arrived at Aldwick Park on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October contained 117 words. I have counted them. Precision matters in a story that turned, in the end, on the complete absence of a single name. Lord Caspian Rowe, Earl of Greymere, wrote, through his solicitors, as such things were done in those careful, deliberate years, that he sought introduction to a daughter of Sir Bramwell Colton of Aldwick Park, Derbyshire, with a view to forming a suitable matrimonial connection. He specified his own credentials at some length, his estate in Worcestershire, his income, which was considerable, his age of 36, his family's long and cordial association with the Colton name through his late father's friendship with Sir Bramwell. He specified almost nothing about what he required of the daughter in question, except that she be unmarried, of good character. And this was the phrase that would later cause a remarkable amount of quiet trouble, capable of managing a large household with steady efficiency. What he did not specify, not in the letter, not in any correspondence that followed, was which daughter. Sir Bramwell Colton had two. I want you to understand something about Sir Bramwell before we go any further, because his assumptions shaped everything that came after, and I have found across a great many evenings by this fire that the damage done by unchecked assumptions is almost always invisible to the person doing the assuming. Sir Bramwell was not a cruel man. He was not particularly stupid. He was simply a man who had sorted his household into categories many years ago, and had not since troubled himself to review them, because everything continued to function well enough, and well enough had always been for Sir Bramwell a perfectly satisfactory outcome. Category 1, Arabella. 22 years old, his younger daughter, and by a considerable margin the one the world had decided to pay attention to. She had her mother's colouring, golden, bright, the sort of face that other faces turned toward without quite knowing they were doing it, and she had spent her 22 years being told, directly and indirectly, by every signal the world sent her way, that this face was her surest and most valuable asset, and that the wisest thing she could do with it was spend it well before time or circumstance diminished it. She was not vain, exactly. She was simply realistic, in the particular way of a young woman who has learned that her beauty is a currency, and that currencies, wisely managed, can purchase a remarkable amount of security. Category 2, Millicent, 29 years old. Sir Bramwell's elder daughter by his first marriage, a fact which Sir Bramwell had arranged, over the years, to think about as little as possible, and the unmistakable air of a woman. Partly because thinking about it raised certain uncomfortable questions about maternal trusts and inheritance settlements that his solicitors had attempted to raise on multiple occasions, and partly because Millicent had been so quietly competent for so long that it had become genuinely difficult to imagine her in any other role. She kept the household accounts. She managed the correspondence with the tradespeople and the creditors and the steward and the solicitors themselves. She taught Sir Bramwell's twin sons their arithmetic and their French, and, unofficially, their ability to think a problem through rather than walking past it. She had been doing all of this since she was 23, when Lady Colton, Arabella's mother, not her own, had taken ill, and the household had needed someone to hold it upright, and Millicent had simply been the one who did it, in the quiet, efficient way of a person who has decided that the work matters more than the recognition. Sir Bramwell read Lord Rowe's letter 3 times. He did not show it to either daughter. He went to find Lady Colton and told her with the confidence of a man who has made up his mind before the conversation begins, that the Earl of Greymere was coming to Aldwick Park with matrimonial intentions, and that they should make certain Arabella was at her absolute best. Lady Colton agreed entirely and began at once planning the necessary arrangements. Millicent found the letter on a Thursday afternoon, not through any particular effort, but because she was the one who filed the household correspondence, as she was the one who handled most things at Aldwick Park that required handling without ever being formally assigned. She read it standing at her father's writing table with the low autumn light coming through the window at a useful angle, and she understood its ambiguity within the first reading. A daughter, not Arabella, not Millicent, a daughter, unspecified, of Sir Bramwell Colton of Aldwick Park. She also understood, without having to think about it particularly hard, why her father had not mentioned the letter to her. She was 29 and long past the years of active consideration. She had been installed so thoroughly in the function of household manager that the household itself had likely forgotten. She was a person who might be considered at all. She was the one who kept the creditors at bay and the linen cupboard in order, and her father's accounts from falling over. She was not, in the understood arrangement of Aldwick Park, the daughter an earl was likely to come inquiring after. She put the letter back exactly where she had found it. She said nothing to anyone. She went to prepare the guest rooms for a visitor her father had not troubled to tell her was coming. Because preparing guest rooms was also something that needed doing, and Millicent had a long and settled practice of doing what needed doing without waiting to be asked. Lord Caspian Rowe, Earl of Greymere, arrived in the village of Brooksfield a full day before the date specified in the formal arrangements. He came alone, on a hired horse rather than his own carriage, and he took a room at the Croft and Crown under the name Mr. Rowe, no title attached, no man of business at his side, no announcement of any kind. The innkeeper assumed him to be a solicitor from the city, or possibly a land agent, and asked nothing further. I want to be honest with you about his reasons, because they matter to the shape of everything that followed. Lord Rowe was not a man who enjoyed games. He was not given to schemes or the particular cleverness that finds satisfaction in watching other people not know they are being watched. He was careful. The kind of careful that comes not from timidity but from having seen, more than once, what happens when significant decisions are made under conditions designed entirely for performance. He was 36. He had watched enough men of his acquaintance marry very attractive, very accomplished strangers at house. Parties, arranged precisely for the purpose of such marriages, and spend the subsequent decades managing the gap between what had been presented and what was actually there. He had decided, if he was going to do this necessary and irreversible thing, to first see, honestly, without arrangement, what was actually there. He did not expect much of a Saturday morning in a Derbyshire market village. What he found was the Brooksfield Autumn Harvest Festival, held every year in the churchyard and surrounding green, and attended, he gathered from the innkeeper's idle conversation, by most of the respectable households in a 5-mile radius. The Coltons arrived mid-morning. Lord Rowe was sitting on a bench outside the inn, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and no pretense of reading anything. He watched them cross the green, and he did what he had come here to do, which was simply to look. Arabella arrived first in a warm gold yellow that the pale October light treated very kindly. She was precisely as handsome as her reputation had suggested. The sort of face that draws every eye in a crowd without any apparent effort on its own part. And she moved through the festival with the comfortable assurance of someone who has always been the most admired person in any room she entered. She greeted people pleasantly, and laughed at the right moments and admired the right things. And it was charming, genuinely charming, the way that a well-rehearsed piece of music is charming. She was performing, but she performed with real skill, and you could not hold it against her, because she had been prepared for performance by everyone and everything that had shaped her, and she was doing what she had been shaped to do. Millicent walked beside her, carrying the basket. She wore grey-brown wool that the October light did not particularly flatter, and did not particularly need to. She had the look of a person who had come to the festival with a list. In the first 20 minutes, Lord Rowe watched Arabella be graciously admired by a considerable number of people, and accomplish nothing in particular. He watched Millicent speak quietly with one of the festival organizers, discover that the delivery of cider to the East Tent had been miscounted, and arrange a correction with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems that no one else had noticed needed solving. He watched her sit down, without any evident concern for her dress in the grass, beside a small boy who had fallen and scraped his knee, speaking to the child with a calm that settled him visibly in under a minute. He watched her spend a long, unhurried stretch of time talking with the vicar's elderly mother. Not in the manner of someone fulfilling an obligation, but in the manner of someone who was genuinely interested in what the old woman was saying. Bending close to hear and laughing at something, she said with a laugh that was entirely unguarded and transformed her whole direct, strong-featured face into something that was, he realized with some quiet surprise, not plain at all. He noticed that every person she stopped to speak with called her by her Christian name. Not Miss Colton. Millicent. As though the formal distance had simply worn away between them over years of her being present in their lives in a way that mattered. He remained on his bench considerably longer than his cold coffee required. The second thing happened that same afternoon, and I want to tell you about it carefully, because it is the one that settled the matter, though he would not fully understand the shape of what had been settled until he was sitting across from her in the small morning room at Aldwick Park, and heard it in her own words. He was walking the lane that ran along the old stone perimeter wall of Aldwick Park, when he heard voices on the other side of a gap where the wall had crumbled and not been repaired. Another item, he thought, on Millicent's long and invisible list of things that needed attending to. The voices belonged to the Colton sisters, walking in the park beyond. He stopped, intending to move on, and found that he had already heard too much to pretend with any honesty that he hadn't. "He comes tomorrow," Arabella was saying. Her voice was easy and bright and carried the way voices do when their owners have never had occasion to be careful about projecting too far. "And I want you to let me manage the conversation, Millie. I mean it kindly. You have a way of saying exactly what you think, which is an excellent quality in a household manager, and absolutely ruinous in a first meeting with an earl." "I'll try to be agreeable," Millicent said. Her voice was quieter and lower, with a dryness underneath it that was not quite humor and not quite bitterness, but something between the two. "Don't be difficult. I'm only saying it because it's true. If this goes well, Father's creditors give him room to breathe, and everyone is better off, including you. You could stop worrying about the household books for 5 minutes." "And if he's unkind?" Millicent asked. Arabella made a small, easy sound. "Then I'll manage. It's what one does, isn't it? Women in these situations manage. We have always managed." There was a silence. Then Millicent spoke again, and her voice had shifted. The dryness was gone from it, replaced by something quieter and more direct, the voice of a person who has decided to say a true thing out loud, even though no one has asked. "I don't want to manage, Ara. I want to live. I want a life I chose, rather than a life I ended up with by being the one who stayed and kept everything running. I want someone who speaks to me as a person, not as a very efficient piece of household furniture." She was quiet a moment. "I know that isn't what's available. I know Lord Rowe is not coming to Aldwick Park with any thought of me. I'm not saying this to be dramatic. I'm saying it because you asked what I was worried about, and that's the honest answer. That I will spend the rest of my life managing things and calling it living until I can no longer distinguish between the two." Arabella's voice, when she answered, was softer than it had been. "I know, Millie, I know. I'm sorry." They moved on, their voices fading into the distance of the park. Lord Rowe stood in the lane for some time after they had gone. He thought about the child in the grass and the cider and the old woman by the tent, and he thought about the woman who had said, "I want to live rather than I want a title," and he thought about the word manage and the particular way she had said it, not bitterly, but with the weariness of a person who has been managing so long that the word has stopped being a choice and become simply the air she breathes. He walked back to the Croft and Crown and sat in the small public room until dinner and thought very carefully about a decision he had not expected to make this quickly, and had apparently just made. He presented himself at Aldwick Park the following morning at the appointed time, in his own carriage, under his own name and title, exactly as the formal arrangements required. Sir Bramwell met him at the door with the frantic warmth of a man who has been awaiting his own rescue with increasing urgency. Lady Colton was composed and welcoming. Arabella was positioned in the drawing-room, in a dress the colour of early morning, and her smile was perfectly pitched to the occasion. Lord Rowe stepped inside, received Sir Bramwell's welcome with courtesy, inclined his head to Lady Colton, and looked at Arabella, who was waiting for the look and met it with the very finest version of herself. He held the look for a moment longer than strict politeness required. Then he turned, without ceremony or explanation, to the woman standing near the window in grey-brown wool, who appeared to have positioned herself there, with the deliberate intention of being unobtrusive during someone else's important occasion. "Miss Millicent Colton," he said. It was not a question. Millicent looked up from the middle distance she had been studying and met his eyes with the directness that he already knew from a Saturday morning's observation was simply how she was built. "Yes, my lord." "I have reviewed the correspondence with my own solicitors," Lord Rowe said, and his voice, though quiet, carried clearly to every person in that still room. "The letter specifies a daughter of Sir Bramwell Colton. I am given to understand there are two. I am also given to understand that the maternal settlement, the trust from your grandmother's estate, is held in your name as the elder daughter, and releases only upon your marriage. The formal correspondence therefore properly pertains to you. I would be grateful for a few minutes of your time, if you are willing. Now, my dear listeners, if you have been sitting with me long enough by this fire to sense the shape of what is coming, I am going to ask you to stay just one moment before we reach it. These are the stories I keep for evenings like this for a reason, and I would rather tell them right than quickly. If you find yourself wanting to hear the rest of what was said in that small morning room at Aldwick Park, and every conversation that came after it, perhaps you will consider making your seat by this fire a permanent one. The subscribe button is just below this video, and it costs nothing, and it means considerably more to me than I am perhaps entirely dignified in admitting. Now back to Aldwick Park. The silence that followed Lord Rowe's address had the particular quality of a room discovering, all at once, that the floor was located somewhere other than where everyone had been confidently standing. Sir Bramwell opened his mouth and closed it again. The trust he had been successfully, not thinking about, for 3 years arriving in his understanding, now with some considerable force. Lady Colton's hands tightened on her handkerchief. Arabella stood very still, her expression not shattered. She was too collected for that, but rearranged in the space of 1 second, from performance into something entirely unguarded, a young woman absorbing an outcome she had not prepared for. Millicent looked at Lord Rowe and said, quietly enough that only he heard it, "I see. Yes, my lord. I think I would like to hear your explanation." They sat in the small morning room at the back of the house, where Millicent kept her correspondence and her account books, and, he suspected, the better part of herself. He told her the whole truth plainly in the order it had happened. He told her he had arrived a day early and why. He told her about the festival, the child, the cider, the old woman by the tent. He told her about the gap in the garden wall and the conversation he had not been entitled to hear, and every word of it that he had carried back to the inn on Saturday afternoon. He told her about the trust. The maternal settlement, the reason his solicitors had identified the Colton family in the first place, the financial mechanism that gave his choice a technical logic he wanted her to understand clearly. And then he told her, with the same directness, that the trust was the reason he had come to Aldwick Park. And the festival on Saturday was the reason he was sitting here now, and that those had turned out to be two entirely different things that pointed, by what he could only describe as good fortune, in the same direction. Millicent was quiet for a moment. "You stood on the other side of a broken wall," she said, "and listened to a private conversation and made a significant decision about both my sister and myself on the basis of it. Yes. I am not sure how comfortable I am with that. You should not be, said Lord Rowe. I am not entirely comfortable with it myself, now that I am saying it aloud to you. I will only tell you that I do not know how else a man in my position, considering a woman he has never met, could have seen anything true of her, except in a moment she had not arranged for his benefit. I am not asking you to approve of the method. I am asking you to believe that what it showed me was genuine. She studied him. What would you have done if it had been the other way around? If my sister had been the one at the wall, the one who said she wanted to live rather than manage? Lord Rowe answered without hesitation, because he had already thought about it carefully. I would have been in a harder position. I would have proceeded with the introduction, assessed your sister honestly and likely found her charming and suitable, and I would have made a suitable arrangement, and it would have been perfectly adequate and considerably cold, and I would have gone back to Greymere and called it settled. He paused. Instead, I find myself sitting across from a woman who said I want to live instead of I want a title, which is not what I expected to find, and I find I am not willing to pretend I didn't hear it. Millicent said nothing for a moment. Then, "What are you actually asking from me, Lord Rowe?" "A real answer," he said, "when you have had enough time to give one." She asked for 3 days. He agreed without any pretense of inconvenience, and spent those 3 days at the Croft and Crown, reading books he afterwards had some difficulty recalling the plots of, and discovering, with no small amount of surprise, that he was genuinely uncertain about the outcome of a situation he had entered, fully intending to control. On the morning of the 4th day, Millicent came to the inn. She sat across from him in the small front parlour, her hands folded on the table, and she said, without any opening pleasantry, "I need you to hear something before I give you an answer. I am not the woman you may have assembled from a single festival morning and an overheard conversation through a gap in a garden wall. I am not patient. I am occasionally quite short with people who make the same preventable mistake more than twice, and living with my father has ensured that happens with some frequency. I have been running this household for 6 years, on short resources and shorter appreciation, and I am tired in ways I have not let myself name aloud until recently. I do not want you to mistake my competence for contentment, or my capacity to endure for strength. I have endured because the alternative was not enduring, and those are not the same thing." She did not look away from him. "I want to be chosen. I can say that plainly now, because not saying it plainly has not served me particularly well. I have wanted it for longer than I intend to admit, and I would like it to happen honestly, as this tired, occasionally cross, quite complicated person I have just described, rather than as whatever quieter and more impressive version of myself you may have constructed from a Wednesday afternoon's listening." Lord Rowe looked at her for a long moment, and something in the careful, composed expression he generally kept over his own face gave way quite completely. "I did not come to Brooksfield looking for someone arranged," he said. "I came because I needed to marry, and I wanted it to mean something, and I did not know, until very recently, whether those two things could happen in the same place at the same time. I have kept Greymere together for 10 years by making myself go look at the actual thing rather than the report someone else prepared about it." "You are not a report, Miss Colton. You are the thing itself, and you are considerably more than I came here expecting to find, and I would rather have you tired and honest and cross when you have reason to be than anyone else at their most polished and prepared." "You cannot know that yet," Millicent said. "No," he agreed. "I am asking you to give me the opportunity to find out." She said yes. Not with relief, though there was some of that underneath it, the way there is warmth underneath the surface of still water. Not with the gratitude of a woman who has been waiting her whole life to be asked, though she had been waiting longer than she would comfortably admit, and she knew it. She said it the way she did most things, directly, with the clean decisiveness of a woman who, when she has made up her mind, makes it up all the way, and Lord Caspian Rowe, Earl of Greymere, who had spent 36 years being quite certain of how every important situation in his life would resolve, found himself sitting in a village inn parlour in Derbyshire, across from a woman in grey-brown wool, who had just said yes to him with her hands flat on the table and her eyes entirely steady, and feeling something he had no previous experience of associating with the practical business of marriage. Something very much like being precisely where he was supposed to be. Arabella took it better than anyone had expected, and I want to give her that credit because I have not made her a villain in this story, and I will not let the ending treat her as one. She was hurt, genuinely and sharply, in the way of a young woman who has arranged her entire near future around a single expectation and is now required to rebuild from open ground. She wept privately for the better part of 2 days, and Millicent sat with her through much of it, which tells you something rather more important about who Millicent actually was than any amount of ledger-keeping or festival logistics could have conveyed. But Arabella was not broken, and she was not cruel, and she did not blame her sister, which was the truest indicator of her character that anyone at Aldwick Park had ever been given cause to observe. She was presented the following spring at a house party in Cheshire, where she met a cheerful and sincerely besotted young gentleman of independent means named Mr. Sutton Bragg, who admired her beauty without once appearing to consider it the entire sum of her worth, and who asked her opinions about things and listened to the answers with what seemed to be genuine interest. She found she had more opinions than she had previously given herself credit for holding. She married him in June. She was, by all subsequent accounts I have been able to gather, expansively and lastingly happy in that marriage. Some people are simply better suited to a cheerful Mr. Bragg than to a reserved Earl, and there is no diminishment in that at all. Now, I want to say one last thing to you before I leave this fire for the evening, and I want you to hear it plainly because I have been working up to it across everything I have just told you. Sir Bramwell Colton had 2 daughters. He had sorted them years before any letter arrived, years before any earl formed any intention, into categories he had never once stopped to revisit. One was the valuable one, one was the useful one. He had built his entire household and his entire plan for its preservation around that easy, unexamined sorting, and he had gone on believing it, unchallenged, until a quiet man in a hired coat sat on a bench, outside a country inn on an October morning, and saw, in the space of a single Saturday, what a father had missed in 29 years. It took a stranger, my dears. That is the part I want you to sit with. The person who keeps everything running, the one who arranges the things that allow everyone else to perform, the one who sits with the grieving and solves the overlooked problems and is present, reliably and without complaint, at every moment when presence is required and goes unthanked. You know someone like that. Most of us do, if we are honest. Many of us have been that person, at one time or another, in one household or another, wondering whether anyone would ever stop looking past us to see what was actually there. Look, I am asking you, on behalf of every Millicent who has ever stood near a window at the edge of someone else's occasion, waiting to be unobtrusive, look at the capable, overlooked person in your life with the honest eyes of a stranger, and see whether what you find there is something your long familiarity has simply blinded you to. If you are new to Moonlight at Marlowe, and you have stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, I am genuinely glad you found your way here. There is a subscribe button below, and I will not press it at any length, only say that this fire burns every week and every story I bring to it has been kept because it has something true in it worth the telling. It costs nothing to stay. It would mean a great deal. And if you have been here before, welcome back. Thank you for coming back to the fire. Millicent Colton sat in the end, in a room she had chosen, a house she had come to as a partner rather than a caretaker, a life she had built on honest ground rather than patient endurance, and I am told that some mornings, in the first light coming through the windows of Greymere, She would think of a Tuesday afternoon in her father's study, a letter on a writing table, 117 words, with not a single name among them. It had looked at first like nothing at all. It was, of course, everything.